This is Transported from Rome to Austin, Part 3. Firstly, I think it's useful to do a little catch-up on many of the, as ever, wild stories that have been descending on the Middle East in the last 2 weeks. Among others, I noticed that al-Jilani in Syria apparently made comments along the lines that, under the right conditions, he would be willing for Syria to join the Abraham Accords. Similar noises have been made by various Iraqi MPs. Jordan officially banned the Muslim Brotherhood. Lebanon seems to have begun to get pretty serious on Hezbollah disarmament. Mahmoud Abbas picked a vice president who is his likely successor and seems to be a fairly pragmatic guy with whom the Israelis can do reasonable business. And all of this, at the time at least, seemed to be incredibly positive. All of that would have seemed to indicate what I've been saying might happen and obviously hoped would happen since the very beginning, which is that once Israel restores its deterrence, defeats Hamas, defeats the rest of the Iranian ring of fire, defangs Iran, then the Saudis will come to the table, bringing many other countries from the Muslim and Arab world. The India-Saudi-Israel axis can fully align, and that would especially have been credible given the India-Pakistan meltdown in the last few weeks. Now, I've been warning since the very outset about the risk of Qatar, that they seem to me to be a most malign actor, very sinister, and it has always been challenging to understand just who they have in their pockets, even to the extent that there were people in Netanyahu's office who are supposed to have been on the Qatari payroll for various projects. We know that Steve Witkoff has various economic interests with Qatar. And the last few days have proven to be incredibly unnerving in terms of the news that Trump is coming to the Middle East, not visiting Israel, bringing together all the other Arab leaders, including apparently the Palestinian Authority, and that there is rumor that he might even recognize a Palestinian state. It's also totally bizarre, not completely outside the realm of possibility with Trump, that he may receive this posh new Air Force One from Qatar. The point at which a state like that feels that it can make what amounts to a $400 million open bribe, bearing in mind that that plane will become a part of the Trump presidential library after Trump finishes his 4 years in power, should be a cause of great concern for all of us. The last week or two have really, I think, been the first moment in this war, which has lasted the thick end of 18 months now, where I've really begun to question whether Israel is actually going to come out on top. I think that it probably is necessary for Israel to go through with its threat to finish the job with Hamas in Gaza. I think that it is absolutely the right strategy to try and create a humanitarian area to feed Gazans where Hamas cannot simply appropriate all of the aid and sell it for great margins, and also to just have the logistical control of that aid, because it's the thing that then gives them the leverage to stay in power. It's a great shame it's taken Israel 18 months to get there. People like me were saying this on about October the 7th and 3 hours after the attack began, that the best thing to do was to hermetically seal Gaza and to do this from the outset, to be able to take complete control of who gets what aid and where and on what basis, whilst you work out what to do with Hamas and the hostages. Naturally, of course, everyone is making the usual screams and shouts about ethnic cleansing and mass starvation and so on. I noticed that even the people who hate us the most, the various NGOs, they are saying that there are 10,000 cases of child malnutrition in Gaza. Whilst this is very tragic, one should bear in mind that there are the thick end of 1 million children in Gaza, so we're talking about 1% of the child population. If you want to have a look at what the malnutrition rate is in countries around the world, including the OECD, you would be amazed to find that in places such as Italy, France, Canada, the United Kingdom, the rate is supposed to be 2.5%. Of course, for any project to rearrange the way in which aid is delivered to Gaza to have a chance to succeed, we needed the Americans and the Gulf states. And at the exact time where we may have been able to deal Hamas a final blow by taking this power away from them, We have been abandoned, it seems, by America and the Gulf states. The only reason, I think, for not losing hope just yet is that Trump seems to change his mind on very major issues pretty much on a daily basis. So who knows, by the time he actually gets to the Gulf, perhaps he will have a different view of things. What I am most afraid of is that he has decided to make a grand bargain with the Arab states, Iran, Qatar, and even the Palestinians at the expense of Israel. Those of us who've been frantically hoping that his son-in-law Jared Kushner would somehow get more involved in these negotiations are now feeling sorely disappointed and vindicated. So we wait with bated breath to see what this big announcement of Trump might be. It had seemed to me that over the last year or so, as Trump was starting to speak during the course of his election campaign on the Middle East, that he was placing his trust in the Israelis and MBS and MBZ, that's to say the leaders of Saudi Arabia and the UAE respectively, and certainly not the likes of Erdogan or Sisi, or God forbid the Qataris or the Iranians, as the way to align American interests with some of the Middle Eastern heavyweights that could do most of the policing of this part of the world on the US's behalf. Perhaps we will be pleasantly surprised and find that Israel is actually included in these conversations still, and that what is going to be announced is a comprehensive signing to the Abraham Accords of various of these countries, an agreement with Qatar that, as I said very early on, they really cannot continue to play both sides of this conflict. They either can be a NATO strategic non-member partner, or they can be a state sponsor of terrorism, but they cannot continue to effectively be both. Perhaps this is the moment where Qatar are also going to switch sides. The best way to put pressure on the Iranians is similarly going to be to remove one of their last allies in the region, in Qatar, and to also give them some carrots that they too could have what is likely to be given to the Saudis in terms of civilian nuclear capabilities. What is quite alarming is that the original Saudi-US deal, even under Biden, who was something of a fair-weather friend to Israel, I think, did include that normalization with Israel was a prerequisite for these giant deals. Trump has explicitly not bothered to keep that clause in. That suggests to me that, for whatever reason it is, the Saudis continue to wish to hedge and to not have to recognize Israel at this point, and that should be, again, of great concern. Is it that the likes of Qatar have compromat on all of these different people? Is it that the Arab street is so enraged by what they perceive as Israel's genocidal behavior against the Palestinians, even though we know they have no love lost for actual Palestinians, just for the idea of Jews beating Muslims in a war or anything else? And so the Saudis are now worried about their own survival. That would seem a little strange at a moment when, as already mentioned, you can see in countries like Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, even Abbas calling Hamas the sons of dogs, there is a willingness for much more vulnerable ruling parties to take risks on the way in which they try to engage with, or at least not speak terribly of, Israel, and to be quite explicit about Hamas and their ideological parent company, the Muslim Brotherhood, or indeed their Shiite sister organization, Hezbollah. Now, to bring this back to the original theme of From Rome to Austin, we know that the previous pope ritually washed the feet of immigrants in what one could only assume was either a classic example of Gadsad's suicidal empathy or some version of self-preservation for the Catholic Church. People talk about the woke right, and the question is, do we have a woke Pope? Do we have a woke Vatican? Where do they stand on Israel and the Jews? We know that whilst the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s decided to exonerate the collective Jews for the guilt of crucifying Jesus, there is certainly a very mixed bag of opinions on Jews and Israel within the Catholic Church. Maybe they didn't really want to forgive the Jews, but it was too close to the Holocaust and they just got guilted into it. To a large extent, the Catholic Church appears to be in its death throes in any case, in most of the Western world at least. So this could be the moral wheel that will break its back, just like it is for the West, that they will basically sacrifice their Jews to try and be eaten last by the Islamist crocodile. It is hard to believe that people in the position of a pope are so genuinely ill-informed that they really think that it is Israel that is damaging Bethlehem and persecuting Christians, as opposed to it quite obviously being Palestinian Muslim Arabs, not just Hamas, but also the Palestinian Authority that have routinely done so. So the Catholic Church, for its own survival, has to cherry-pick its issues, whilst it may want to maintain a reasonably strict standard on abortion or marital relations or homosexuality. It can go to town on the Greta Thunberg twin passion causes of environmentalism and Israel. Of course, the bitter irony is that on the issues on which the Catholic Church is still so conservative, they're actually very much aligned to Islamism. Perhaps not in the degree to which they would enforce their views, but certainly in the views themselves. It seems to me that we really should make a much bigger effort as Jews to reach out to Catholic groups in various parts of the world where they may be more inclined to align with Israel, to try and put some pressure on the Vatican to at least take a more neutral stance when it comes to the issue of Israel-Palestine. In many ways, the Pope is a bit like the BBC. People just assume a certain amount of authority when he speaks. They assume a level of neutrality and objectivity. But that's not what I hear. When I hear claims by the last Pope that Israel is committing some kind of genocide, what I hear is that this is the new version of the Jews killed Jesus. And it certainly doesn't feel like we have allies in the UK right now. David Lammy has been hinting at a recognition of Palestine. There's the ongoing refusal to have a serious inquiry about Pakistani rape gangs. We're still not quite sure what's going to happen to this potential Islamophobia law. And even what is now emerging as the main opposition party, Reform, hardly seem to be the champions of the Jewish people or British-Israeli relations. It's also emerged that what Keir Starmer said about the Southport riots is now proven to be untrue, that there was no great far-right conspiracy to make all of these protests, and therefore the way in which people were shut down certainly now appears to be conclusively extremely heavy-handed. No wonder the likes of David Betts are talking about there being all the conditions in place for serious civil unrest in the UK. Meanwhile, we had, of course, the Gaza documentary that the BBC had to pull, although I think they probably put it back by now with some caveats. And we've just had Louis Theroux's extremely unsympathetic look at some of the worst settlers in the West Bank to try and give us another kick in the balls over there, without any of the nuance of the hundreds of thousands of perfectly ordinary people who are technically settlers, or the fact that the majority of those technical settlers would remain in Israel proper under any sensibly structured peace accords that actually would hold with the Palestinian Authority through a series of land swaps. But it's much more fun to dig out the most radical 0.1%. Incidentally, on my last trip to London, I went to see an excellent play called Giant, which is about Roald Dahl and his anti-Semitism. And he spoke in a way that is completely reminiscent of what has become totally normalized language now against Israel, and that was understood then to be pretty obvious code for hating Jews. The play is really disturbing, and I commented afterwards that you could tell who the Jews were in the audience because they were the ones leaving with ashen faces. The play focuses on the way in which Roald Dahl, during the Lebanon War, essentially looks at some of the alleged atrocities that the Israelis carried out and uses it as a cudgel to beat all Jews with if they fail to separate themselves from Israel. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? No concept of intent, no concept of being provoked. Just straight up, the Jews should be willing to take a beating, otherwise they're not good Jews. I have a real sense of the walls closing in on us. In the UK, in the US, where, for example, I noticed a recent Harvard graduation ceremony that was Palestinian themed, apparently, and it really reminded me of the early 1980s short film The Wave, which is really worth watching. You can get it on YouTube, where essentially people can be turned into a cult remarkably easily if they just find a convenient scapegoat. And of course now, with the way things seem to be moving, for Israel too, it seems to be a very vulnerable moment. In a world where the number of people who can successfully champion Jews in Israel seems to be reducing, it occurred to me that we often talk about useful idiots, and that made me think that perhaps we should also extend this to there being useless idiots, useful non-idiots, and useless non-idiots. So, for example, in the context of Israel, you have gullible masses, grifters, and fall guys who are useful idiots for the Palestinian cause, and indeed I would widen it to the Islamist cause, even though they may not understand that's what they're actually supporting, into which bucket you can drop Dave Smith and people like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, and even people like Steve Witkoff, or Twitkopf as I've started to call him. And then you have your useless idiots who are just too stupid or mad to be deliver or be credible. So you can put Diane Abbott into that category, Alex Jones for being crazy, and so on. You have useful non-idiots who are credible, smart people who really believe they don't need to be controlled. They're happy to jump on the bandwagon. Owen Jones, Mehdi Hassan, Ian Carroll, we've mentioned all these people before. And then you have the useless non-idiots who just don't fall for the crap. Douglas Murray, Bill Maher, Barry Weiss, but it's a small group of people compared to the big lot of idiots and non-idiots who are willing to come after us. And my fear is it may turn out that Trump is essentially a useless idiot, that he doesn't have the wherewithal to really understand these issues on any deep level. He has no real strategy, and that he's so easily led. The only good thing about useless idiots is that they tend to be highly erratic. So, as I say, he could easily change course. The problem is that for him to change course would require two things to happen. One is for Bibi to have a completely different approach to both Trump and, I think, his wider leadership of Israel. And it would need people within the Jewish community, again, perhaps even the Jews in Trump's own family, to stand up within the US and really make a difference in terms of trying to influence his thinking. The problem with Podcastistan is exactly the same problem as there is in the mainstream media. Somebody ends up giving a narrative to an audience, and then the audience forms their opinions based on that narrative. It's become increasingly unclear where one is editorializing and where one is simply delivering facts and direct reporting on an issue. We are, much like 18 months ago, in the position where we need to somehow snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. That can only probably occur if the IDF goes in and does its best to finish the job of getting rid of Hamas, hopefully frees most of the hostages alive, and that will deliver a serious blow to the credibility of everybody in that Hamas axis, as well as all of the various parties that have continued to hedge their bets. It's not a coincidence, in my view, that just today, suddenly Hamas have agreed to release Idan Alexander, presumably at Qatar's say-so, as the only likely living American hostage. Trump is very into his symbolism, and they know that this will play well with him, and it will also probably go some way to making a position, much like we had under Biden, where the Americans put pressure on Israel not to attack, or they try and curtail the way in which Israel is able to operate. I've said for many years that I'm not an inherently anti-Bibi guy, just like I'm inherently not an anti-Trump guy. I try to be, I would say, as objective as I can be, just to take these people on their merits and demerits. But I think we are really now beginning to see that Bibi's strategy, not just since October the 7th, but going further back than that, of always kicking the can down the road, always hedging, is really beginning to crumble. I don't envy him the job, and I'm not sure that anyone else could have done that much better. But one of the big things that Bibi is supposed to be able to deliver is this great relationship with the Americans, with Trump, to have a way to be persuasive. And yes, Israel cannot buy $400 million jets for Trump, but there are other things that we can do. More countries joining the Abraham Accords, especially led by Saudi Arabia, probably would have led to a Donald Trump Nobel Peace Prize, which is clearly something that he is very keen to get. This is a man with a very large ego, and I'm quite sure that there were other Sops and Phillips that could have been considered. Similarly, over the long trajectory of Bibi's time as Prime Minister, he has grasped, usually a little on the late side, what the zeitgeist might be. So he has appeared on a couple of these long-form podcast interviews in which he does extremely well. He's very articulate and brilliant. We've known this since he was a 20-something, appearing in debates in the US and on the floor of the UN. This was where Israel needed to engage in the battle for hearts and minds, which was the eighth front in this war. And the government has really failed to provide the proper resources to do so. It has taken private citizens to do it. Now they're suddenly talking about blowing 500 million shekels, which is $130-odd million, building some amazing new Hasbara program. But I really doubt that they're going to be capable of finding the correct strategy to be able to oversee such a thing. And in many ways, we don't want to be like the Qataris, where we have to throw money at people and just buy their loyalty. The beauty of the way in which the pro-Israel community operates is that it comes from people who just want to do it because it's the right thing to do. Paying them money will just tarnish that. Yes, there should be some professionals in the Israeli government who can help with polishing the message, with perhaps the apparatus to make a decent podcast or film or whatever. Much more encouragement to bring such people to Israel to see things with their own eyes. The place that the Israeli government needed and needs to spend its resource is at a diplomatic level, trying to make sure that, for example, the Pope doesn't loathe us. What I've been trying to convey in this episode is that we used to be able to rely on our institutions, whether they were the old school media like the BBC or the great newspapers of repute, or whether it was an institution like the church. Even if we didn't agree with the religion itself, we could at least trust that there was some inherent knowledge that was within the institution, so that when they spoke with authority on any given subject, it could be trusted. And that the whole point of the podcast era was the ability to take a longer form view at things, unpick them properly, and to make sure through that level of transparency that we really understood what was going on at a time when those institutions had lost our trust because they appeared to be bringing too many of their own biases. And of course, because the 24-hour news cycle meant that it was impossible to keep up with the long arc of a story in a way that perhaps we would have used to do. Indeed, when people regularly went to church, I suspect that certain long story arcs were told to them on a Sunday morning. When people like me bandy around the word woke, either woke left or woke right, what certainly I am usually driving at with that is the idea that identity is the baseline measure of everything, and that there is always a moral equivalence to be made. Watching Podcastistan fall into much of that same trap is a great disappointment. Nonetheless, it remains a very useful medium for Israel to tell its story, because our story is one that cannot be told simply by showing the classic trump card photograph of a dead Palestinian baby. It requires setting in context of 75 or 80 years of history, if not several thousand years of history, and to take people into a deep engagement with what we are trying to achieve, because it is a complex and nuanced story. And we have to be able to blend the more emotional and emotive aspects of that story with some pretty cold, hard facts. Israel and its spokespeople are frequently accused of callousness because we try to explain why the correct figures for the number of civilians who have died are not 25,000 but 22,000 or whatever it is. And of course, then there's the argument of why are you quibbling over this many dead civilians? There's still plenty of dead civilians and it's all too many. And the same goes for how we might do a better job with, say, the Catholic Church. I'm reminded, I think I've probably told this story on the podcast before, but it's worth retelling, that Jeremy Bowen was once heard to have said to a rather disgruntled Jewish journalist at the BBC, who queried how totally lacking in objectivity he was, that he wasn't required to be objective or neutral. The correct standard was balance. So all he had to do was to show a very sympathetic Palestinian woman talking about her dead baby for 30 seconds and a gun-toting, American-accented, grotesque settler for 30 seconds, and that was balance. Bowen and his editors at the BBC understand full well what happens when you do that and you rely on the BBC's aura of neutrality and objectivity so that you can tell a certain story, move the Overton window, and skew what is really the balance. It seems, unfortunately, that too many other institutions, and the Pope and the Vatican are one of those institutions, take the same kind of view now. That the measure of balance is how many corpses have piled up on each side, the end. Too many people in Podcastistan, like, say, Dave Smith, per the last part of this episode, have fallen into the same moral trap. The Israeli government's job is to find ways to re-establish the bona fides of Israel and the way that it behaves, however annoying it is that we are being held to a higher standard and indeed hold ourselves to a higher standard, however annoying it is from an operational perspective that it means showing a lot of body cam footage and trying to work out what we can and can't show to the international press or to our allies, whether it's behind closed doors or front of house, and how we start to tell that story in both the mainstream media, where we do have an audience for it, and in Podcastistan, where certainly we either can find access to platforms or could build them ourselves, so that the next October the 7th doesn't involve anybody having to wring their hands on both sides of the issue. Indeed, any time that Israel is in any of these debates, whether it's something of a tiff with Erdogan, I would expect, apart from, of course, Greece and Cyprus, to instinctively take Israel's side if we've laid the groundwork so that that is people's instinctive opinion as to who is more likely to be the right and wrong party. The idea of doing this is not to whitewash or exonerate anything that Israel does wrong. We make plenty of strategic, tactical, and operational errors. A thought that occurred to me the other day, incidentally, is that whilst we're being accused of all these various war crimes, the Palestinians and the NGOs and the media are only too quick to make sure that every single thing that they can find is reported. We can count the number of incidents, we can name them, we can talk about Hind Rajab, World Central Kitchen, or the recent incident with the medics, because there don't seem to be that many of them. And I'm sure somebody will argue, yes, but there are others that just aren't being reported because Israel made sure to kill everybody or something along those lines. But it actually seems to me to be quite remarkable that in a war that has gone on for 18 months, that has involved the rotation in and out of Gaza of hundreds of thousands of Israeli soldiers, which means that there have been thousands and thousands of flashpoints and incidents and conflicts, engagements of all sorts, that actually of those thousands and thousands, we are talking about a rounding error in terms of the numbers that have gone horribly wrong in terms of the IDF's judgment. This is all the more impressive when you bear in mind that the people doing this fighting, the vast majority of them, are exhausted reservists away for the third or fourth month in a row from their wives and families and jobs, often people in their 40s who are very much not supposed to be called up anymore. And then you compare that to a story that came out in the British news today about the absolute elite units of the British armed forces and potentially systematic and heinous war crimes that they carried out in Afghanistan. I look forward to Israel and other concerned nations taking the UK and David Cameron to the ICC and the ICJ I no longer believe that the UK has a right to exist as a sovereign nation, and I think that it should be even more overrun by their oppressed victims from Afghanistan, Iraq, and other wars of their causing. We will know tomorrow, when Trump gets to the Middle East, just how much of a mess we are now in. Maybe on the most positive reading of things, if I were to listen more to the likes of Marco Rubio and Mike Huckabee, Secretary of State and American Ambassador to Israel, respectively. If everything that's going on, including the rather grotesque possibility of Idan Alexander being released from Gaza, having one quick hug with his family, and then being flown off to Qatar to be paraded there, in slightly nicer circumstances than a standard Hamas parade, but nonetheless still quite obscene, the best reading would be that actually the thing I've been hoping for this whole time, which is the obligation of Qatar to switch sides, is taking place. And we're going to get some form of détente and expansion of the Abraham Accords, even if some of also what has been said the other way that's giving me this cause for concern, the possibility of some kind of recognition of a Palestinian state. What if that recognition was a Palestinian state in Gaza and, say, Area A, in return for Qatar and Saudi joining the Abraham Accords, and maybe even Iran agreeing not to have any nuclear ambitions of any kind, and in return all of those countries recognizing Israel to the Green Line at least, and then all of the middle ground between the Green Line and Area B is something that we're going to agree to fudge for now. We kick the can down the road. And if we do that, then we pick up Qatari funding and Saudi funding for the rebuilding of Gaza. We can fund a Palestinian Authority, probably led by this more practical and less seemingly corrupt Palestinian vice president. And perhaps that is the best possible reading of what's going on. Total conjecture and probably wishful thinking on my part. Of course, Bibi would probably not allow this to happen, and he wouldn't survive it politically anyway. But perhaps at this point, the Americans and the opposition within Israel and many other countries have understood that it is time to essentially make him the scapegoat, kick him off the cliff with all the sins of war, and use this as an opportunity to remove him from power. It's not like the replacement for Bibi is going to be some soft left candidate anyway. It's just going to be someone who is less beholden to the likes of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and of the Haredim, who have not played an adequate part in this war as far as the vast majority of Israelis are concerned. It's also worth adding that when it comes to some of the appalling messaging that we have to fight on a constant basis on behalf of Israel, I lay that at the feet of the likes of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and the horrific way that they carry on, with absolutely no grasp of, or possibly a grasp and just no interest in, the effect that their words have on diplomatic relations and how it is to be a Jew in the diaspora fighting for Israel. They're either tone-deaf or millenarian or both. And either way, I don't want them in an Israeli cabinet, now or in the future. Anyway, to leave this on a positive note, it looks like one more hostage is coming home. Let's hope for better times in the next few days and for some pleasant surprises. Thank you very much for listening.